Alright, so now we come to my favorite option, and that is that this phrase, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, isn't just introducing the genealogy or the origins, but is in fact introducing the entire gospel. Alright, so how am I going to make this argument? So basically, there are two ways to make this argument. Argument number one, argument number two. Okay, so let's remember the fact that Matthew uses the word biblios geneos. Alright, store that away. So some people are going to argue that by using this phrase, Matthew is alluding to the title of Genesis. Alright, what do I mean by that? Well, as you know, the first book of our Bible is called Genesis, but it wasn't always called Genesis. For instance, the Jews originally called it after the very first word of the book of Genesis, which is Bereshit. So they would say the first book of the Bible is called Bereshit. Bereshit just means in the beginning. And that's how it was referred to originally, and even to this day, the Jewish people will refer to it as Bereshit. So when did the custom of calling it Genesis begin? And what's interesting, Daniel Zacharias, in his book, notes the word Genesis is also used by Philo to refer to the book of Genesis a generation before the Gospel of Matthew was written. So what's he saying? He's saying that 100 years before Matthew, there is a Jew called Philo. And he used the word Genesis to refer to the first book of the Bible. Now this word is the same word that Matthew uses to introduce his book. So let's read what Philo wrote. He wrote, "Of the 5 books in which the holy laws are written, the first bears the name and inscription of Genesis." Genesis, the same word Matthew uses. From the Genesis or creation of the world, an account of which contains at its beginnings, it has received this title in spite of it embracing numberless matters. So this should absolutely shock you that 100 years before Matthew is written, there are people calling the first book of the Bible Genesis, the same word Matthew uses. So when Matthew writes biblios geneos, perhaps this should be translated as the book of Genesis. And this is exactly what Davis and Allison argue. They write that perhaps a more appropriate translation of the verse 1 of Matthew should be book of the new Genesis wrought by Jesus Christ. So I think this is a very interesting case. The fact that we know that 100 years before Matthew, people were using this word to refer to the whole book of Genesis. And this, of course, indicates that perhaps Matthew is introducing his whole book. So that's argument 1. Very interesting. What's argument 2? Let's go over here now. Argument 2. And this is going back to the fact that this phrase, biblios geneos, is used in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And we already talked about Genesis 5:1 in a previous video. This is the book of the generations of Adam. And we said the fact that Matthew uses the same phrase found in Adam's genealogy seems to indicate that Matthew is introducing Jesus's genealogy. But what should be noted is that this phrase, biblios geneos, is found one other place in the Old Testament. It is actually found in Genesis 2:4, where it reads, "This is the book of the generation, biblios geneos, of heaven and earth, when they were made, in the day in which the Lord made the heavens and the earth." Now you're probably thinking, hey, didn't you say back in that other video that the only time book of the generation was used is in Genesis 5:1? I did. But when I said that, I said it was only in the Hebrew. Only in the Hebrew in Genesis 5:1 do we have the words book of the generation, Sefer Toledot. In the Hebrew of Genesis 2:4, in the Hebrew it just says Toledot. It just says this is the generations of the heavens and earth. But the Greek translation, the translation that Matthew was using, has the word book added into it. So the word book is not in the original Hebrew, but the Septuagint added it in. So when Matthew is reading his Septuagint, he sees this phrase, biblios geneos, in 2 places. He sees it not only at the genealogy of Adam, but he also sees it at the creation of the entire world. So therefore, it could be argued that when Matthew uses this phrase, he isn't only referring to the genealogy, but he's also referring to the entire creation. So therefore, the first verse of Matthew is introducing the whole book because, like the usage in Genesis 2:4, it's describing the whole creation. And this point is really well made by Stephen Vorwind. And he writes, the actual expression Biblios Geneas is found in the Greek Old Testament on only 2 occasions, and both in the book of Genesis. In Genesis 2:4, it refers to the account of the origins of the heavens and the earth. Then in Genesis 5:1, these words refer to the list of Adam's descendants. In the LXX, therefore, Biblios Geneas refers to both the beginning of creation and the beginning of humanity. Hence, in his very opening words, Matthew is strongly hinting that God is making a new beginning through Jesus Christ. So I think this is a very well stated point, that Matthew isn't just introducing Adam's descendants. Perhaps if it was only used to introduce Adam's descendants, we could say that Matthew was just introducing the genealogy of Jesus. But the fact that it is used in Genesis 2:4 to refer to the whole creation makes one think that Matthew is indeed introducing his entire gospel. So let's just conclude. I think the best argument is that Matthew, by using this phrase, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, isn't just introducing the genealogy or the origins, but is in fact introducing his whole gospel. And with that, we have really exhausted our study of the very first line of Matthew. And in our next video, we will be analyzing the next line of verse 1, the son of David, the son of Abraham. I promise that the whole book of Matthew is not going to be this verse by verse. We are going to move quicker.